Yeah, so like you saw my little riff at the top of the doc, but I was thinking like
Yes.
either the two titles that I'm now leaning towards, if they, if we can fit them on a thumb,
Uh-huh.
are canceled by the University of the Canceled, or returned to the University of the Canceled,
Return to the
or
university.
sorry, or escape from the University of
Escape
the
from the
Canceled.
University of the Canceled. I love
So
it.
I'm thinking
Oh
about
my
like
God.
that sequel naming structure where like what is it, like Return of the Living Dead,
Yes.
not
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like
Dawn of the
yeah,
University of the Canceled. Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
Welcome everybody to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg, and I'm pleased to be joined on the mic, as always, by my co-host and co-producer Calvin Pollock. How you doing, Calvin?
Doing good, Alex, and I'm really excited to revisit some of our favorite characters from several seasons ago of Reverb.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are just like people that I admire as an academic committed to free speech, liberal discourse, and human flourishing. I
Yes.
think that these are the kind of the leaders in the field. If by the field I mean a literal field somewhere in Austin where buildings are still being constructed, it looks a lot like Fyre Festival. You can
Yes.
get like, you know, teeny tiny bottles of water for $17. It's not a university at all as much as it is a broke down website, but I do love them for their hustle and their grind.
Absolutely. It is deserving of our respect. So, for those of you who have been with us for a while, you'll recall that back in episode 62, all the way back in December of 2021, we did a little episode called The University of the Canceled,
Dun
which
dun dun.
we'll put in a little sound sting there, which Calvin is, of course, referring to the University of Austin. And it is funny, Calvin, that you bring up that metaphor of a fire festival. I went back and listened to that episode last night. All hour and 42 minutes of it. We went really long on that with our friend and colleague Mike Loudenbach, where he actually did compare the concept for University of Austin to the fire festival. And I believe you compared it to a pitch deck or a PowerPoint slide, basically an email marketing scam to get money from billionaires and from other, sort of dark money organizations to found this university that is, as you were alluding to, Calvin, dedicated to the pursuit of truth in an era
Yes.
where higher education feels fundamentally broken. If you go back and listen to that episode, we rejoined two different op-eds, one from Pano Canelos, the former president of St. John's University in Annapolis, Maryland, now the current president of University of Austin, saying that higher education is broken. We're here to fix it. And then, of course, I called him Niall. I believe it's actually pronounced Neil. Neil Ferguson was the British historian and kind of intellectual crank who also wrote an op-ed kind of laying out the mission statement of the University of Austin. That was about 3.5 years ago that this all was announced. And so we thought it was about high time to return to our friends at the University of Austin and see how are things going. How has this project panned out? Keen eared listeners will note I put my money on the idea that this is a concept that will fail at some point, that it is not really long for this world. Yeah, so I guess we can kind of open it up a little bit by, we've got a couple of readings on deck here that we want to talk about. But Calvin, I guess since we recorded that episode, which was all about the sort of crisis of free speech in higher education, the kind of dearth of academic freedom that certain types of intellectuals were yearning for in American universities. How would you compare, let's say, the state of free speech back in that era of 2021 to the state of free speech in higher education now?
I mean, things have gotten considerably worse. And I wouldn't even necessarily isolate it to higher education.
Mm,
It's across the board, particularly since October 2023, since massive U.S. support for the Israeli war in Gaza has kind of become the most incendiary political issue, really globally, but especially, I think, affecting U.S. public discourse in the sense that both major political parties have had to grapple with it in different ways, and both have failed. It played a massive role in the election in 2024. And in higher education, it's obviously inspired a massive grassroots movement of student protest. Not even just this stereotype of like hanging out on the grass, skipping class, taking over buildings, like these sort of physical embodied acts that I think critics of these movements tend to default to when they describe them, but also a lot of really important writing and institution building and documentation and enshrining new ways of engaging democratically as students with how universities are run. And so, in one sense, I would say it's kind of a golden age of free speech and grassroots democracy because there is so much happening and students are doing so much. But at the same time, the repression against those students has been so fearsome to the point where university presidents are collaborating with the federal government to get students kicked off their campuses. So it's this really complex and incendiary mix of a lot of hopeful trends in that students are motivated and engaged and politically inspired at the same time as the institutions they're trying to work within are clamping down so hard. And as far as I know, the University of Austin and the people involved with it have not really said much or done much to advance the cause of free speech in these regards. I'm sure we're going to get into that later. But, and I realize that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think free speech is like formally, it's more restricted right now than it has been since the McCarthy era in the United States. But I would almost say as like an ideal, as a political horizon, as like a normative value, it might be stronger than it's ever been. And I think that combination makes things really uncertain where they'll go from here.
That's a really nuanced answer to that question because I think you're absolutely right. While it is, if you're looking at the news and you see that people who are speaking out against, the current ongoing genocide in Gaza and the war are people like Mahmoud Khalil, Rumeza Ozturk are being detained by federal agencies and, in some cases being, held without even any official charges. In the case of Khalil, in the case of Ozturk, simply for signing on to a collectively authored op-ed about the conflict. And it's tempting to think that we are in an era of just repression. I don't want to downplay the impact of that repression. It is, I think, in large part because of this kind of groundswell of organic grassroots support for one of the defining humanitarian causes of this era in America, which is that American tax dollars are going to fund a genocide. And that is something that this new generation of students is calling attention to, calling for moral and practical accountability to all of this. And as a result, you're seeing these massive crackdowns from colleges and universities themselves, as well as from the federal government. So in that way, I think it's important to just kind of mark here that we're in a different terrain than we were at the time that we recorded that episode. We're in the midst of Trump 2.0 that has shown itself to be, we have literally federal officials going on the news and talking kind of glibly about revoking habeas corpus and denying due process to people based solely on their speech under the guise of calling it terrorism or widening the blanket of what is called anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel.
And we should mention that literally this week, the Homeland Security Secretary defined habeas corpus as the right of the president to remove who he wants from the country.
Yeah, we'll drop that clip of Kristi Noem in here saying that.
So, Secretary Noam, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right to.
Let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
But just kind of an astonishing level of just kind of craven and brazen, not even really trying to like fully justify the actions here, but just kind of a vulgar display of power, to take a quote from a Pantera album title. It is true.
I'll tell you what, my garden gnome would never define habeas corpus that way. We have in fact, we in Seattle have this lovely like public park/art thing called Valley of the Gnomes. If you're ever in town, Alex, I'll show you. It's beautiful. It's like the kind of like forested area between several houses with bridges kind of running across, and underneath are all these hidden garden gnomes. The idea is to go in there and try to spot as many as you can. And that's kind of the game, is like who can count the most gnomes. But none of those gnomes share Christy Gnome's definition of habeas corpus. And they don't even have brains.
I know.
And they know better.
It's a low bar. It really
it's a really
is.
low bar.
They keep finding creative ways to play limbo with it. But that is where we are today. And I think in light of that fact, it's worthwhile to turn our attention back towards a university concept in the University of Austin that purported itself to be an alternative to places where your speech would be stifled, you would be self-censoring, you would be worried about this air of censoriousness that takes place in institutions where the pursuit of truth, of factuality, and of other things are supposed to be privileged, right?
I love a university concept. I was just thinking about that. Like, it's so Austin tech bro brain to be like, we're working with some new university concepts. We're going to see if we can like kind of generate some synergies and innovative new scalable solutions to the university. We're doing dynamic university concepts. This is actually a fast casual university concept, kind of like Chipotle, but for higher education. And so it's going to be great. You can just sort of like order ahead of time with the app and then like touch your phone to the teacher's QR code, and then that will give you the knowledge that you need to succeed in business and technology.
That's right. Do you want some extra guac with your liberal arts degree, bro?
So what have they got for us this time, Alex?
Yeah,
so UATX. By the way, just one other thing about the University of Austin. It will never not be funny to me that they did kind of like, remember when there was that movie The Illusionist and The Prestige, they came out at the same time. It's like when studios like intentionally release another movie at the same time to try to confuse you, so you'll go to the wrong one.
That's right.
That's obviously what they're doing with the University of Texas at Austin.
Absolutely.
Like, we're the University of Austin. Oh, you enrolled in the wrong one? Sorry, this one doesn't have classes. It just has pitch sessions and PowerPoint seminars.
Oh, you're so right. I mean, this is something that we touched on very briefly in the 2021 episode, where you initially had said, when I first heard about this, I was like, why are we crapping on UT Austin? I like the people there. And I told you, I think it's intentional that they named it that so that people would confuse it. Now we are living in the age of, say, just as a brief example, of generative AI search results, where I actually Googled the University of Austin accreditation status in preparation for this episode. And what it originally gave me was, there is accreditation for this, until I read a little bit further and I realized it was not referring to the University of Austin, but the UT Austin. And so you might be wrongly led to think that the University of Austin is an accredited university. Federally, it is not. They are still officially, according to their FAQ, waiting on accreditation won't come until at least 2028 to 2031. But now in the age of like synthetic text generalizing engines being inserted into so much of our tech, linguistic slippages like that are going to be even more difficult to kind of parse through.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess they just enrolled their first class this school year. So this is the first official cohort this year. And do we know how many students are actually enrolled?
Yes, they call them the inaugural 100. There were actually, according to a 60 Minutes report that was done, just a very brief 16-minute clip that was done on 60 Minutes back in November of last year. There are 92 students currently in their freshman class. Not that was less than the size of my high school class where I went to school in a small Wisconsin town of about 4,000 people. But nonetheless, the tuition is free for all of those students, which of course means that it's being bankrolled by dark money funders who are behind the project. And yeah, this is the first class of freshmen who are going through. I don't know what their retention rates are since their semester just ended. It probably will be a while until we see official statistics published for how many students they retain and how many students they'll yield in the next school year.
Really wish I could get my hands on those evals some of those teachers are getting.
Oh, I can only imagine. I can only imagine what we might find. Another, we should say, a real catalyst for bringing this back up is because there was just recently an article that was published in the esteemed online magazine Quillette. I'm, of course, being
great.
a little sarcastic there. Quillette is, of course, known for being a kind of safe harbor for the intellectual dark web or the contrarian kind of right-wing curious or post-left kind of thought leaders. Published by this person called Ellie Avishai, called "Is the University of Austin Betraying Its Founding Principle?" And this was something that I think we also, again, kind of alluded to on our previous episode, which is where when you run something as complex and as, kind of necessarily bureaucratized as a university, where you have lots of people who you're employing at various different levels, you're providing a large array of different services to your students, your clients, whatever you want to call them, you're going to run into some of these just kind of like necessary tensions that the University of Austin was originally proclaiming themselves to be exempt from. And in this case, are they actually in support of academic freedom and freedom of speech? This is, I think, one of the first times that hypothesis has been put to the test in a very public way. So I'm going to start reading from this. I've got some pause points in here, but if you ever want me to stop, Calvin, just feel free to shout out. The creation of UATX, or University of Austin, was heralded as a bold initiative in some circles, but also attracted a number of skeptics. Some wondered if this ostensible homage to the values of classical liberalism wasn't just a glorified right-wing think tank. Under the headline, "Does America Actually Need a New Conservative University?" for instance, Wesleyan University President Michael S. Roth warned Politico readers that UATX was missing the mark by targeting other universities. Quote, "I realize that the University of Austin is trying to raise money from donors whose wallets will open more quickly when they hear complaints about woke warriors or pronoun police," he wrote. Quote, "But you shouldn't misleadingly disparage higher education in order to make a place for yourself, especially when declaring one's devotion to truth," end quote. At the time, however, I found such criticisms unpersuasive. I'd graduated from a Harvard doctoral program in education leadership 3 years earlier, and so was well aware of the problems that the UATX founders had described. In our program, the social justice marching orders were explicit. We were to fight for equity in education, with systemic bias presumed to be the primary cause of unequal outcomes among students. A mass emailed memo we all received from the Harvard Graduate School of Education Student Council shortly after Donald Trump became president in 2017 urged us to, quote, "pledge our support and solidarity with all individuals who face discrimination and systemic injustice," and, quote, "to reflect on concrete steps each of us can take as individuals and collectively to affirm our deeply held values of equity and inclusion," end quote. I was hardly a fan of Trump, but bristled at the pressure to conform to such a sweeping directive. I don't know, does that sound like a sweeping directive to you? The marching orders of the woke Gestapo to you, Calvin?
No, it doesn't, because this is a Harvard Graduate School of Education Student Council statement, right? This is not a marching order. This happens all the time. Like, student legislative bodies like this will make statements that are statements of values. We've seen a lot of these in the current Trump presidency too, including by, faculty council here at UW, talking about like these very real academic freedom issues that we're experiencing right now. But no, this is not a marching order. And also the idea that, so I am fascinated by this quote. In our program, the social justice marching orders were explicit. We were to fight for equity in education, blah, 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 blah. What this sounds like to me is the same thing. We've talked about this a lot. The same thing that happens in every discipline, in the sense that if you were in a doctoral program in physics or in economics, you would probably have faculty members and senior doctoral students who have certain shared values, interests, and methodological commitments, theoretical commitments. And that would be very clear. And ideally, you, in the course of applying to multiple programs, would get a sense of what those are before you commit to a program. And so I would imagine like that it's just sort of taken for granted in that program that this person was a part of, that equity is important in education and that systemic bias is real in education. That's just called a discipline, right?
Right. Well, and the fact is that there's a lot of scholarship that has actually been done to prove
establish
those
those things.
Yes.
It's not just a political statement.
Yeah.
It's an intellectual commitment.
Right. And that is the kind of thing that I think you'll commonly see in a lot of these arguments, particularly that they're making to non-specialists. And this is not me by any means trying to be a technocrat or an elitist here, but that there are people who study these things for a living for a reason, because taking that much time to dedicate to studying a subject and making sure that you actually are able to collect evidence of things like systemic bias in education is fundamentally a really important thing for understanding social problems. To pretend that all of that is just merely a political commitment due to some kind of ideological standpoint does a disservice and is a very real insult to the people who are doing the hard work of conducting that research over the span of decades. And also just, it is its own kind of baldly ideological claim, which is to say that, well, I'm just going to hand wave away all of this evidence and research that systemic bias exists for the reason that I don't feel like looking it up, or that I know that I can flatter people's cognitive biases towards their own sort of self-satisfaction, right?
Yeah. The only other thing I would point out about this, just really quickly, is that there seems to be a real problem solution mismatch here. So even if you grant that programs like this in mainstream academia, if we want to call it that, or like elite academia, are dens, quote unquote, dens of wokeness, they have all of these sort of like politically driven incentives to do certain kinds of work and shut out other kinds of work and hold certain viewpoints. It's not clear to me how that would then motivate you to join this scam university called the University of Austin. So like all of this is setting up that this faculty member understood the appeal of the University of Austin because they saw these quote unquote real problems in mainstream academia, right? And so I'm getting confused about why that would be the solution rather than maybe going to a different industry or like making change from within at a place like Harvard.
Right. Well, and I think as we're going to read on, and this is going to come up a number of different times, as it turns out, there are places where you can still get those, heterodox perspectives that go against the woke mind virus, if you like, and they're called business schools. So anyway, so she goes on to write, the atmosphere I observed at Harvard was starkly different from what I'd experienced elsewhere. In 2005, well in my mid-20s, I left jobs teaching middle school and high school students to earn an MBA at the Rotman School of Management in Toronto, something my family and friends joked about given my propensity to wear flowy skirts and play folk songs at open mic events. Okay.
Can we stop there? Because those cultural markers are not divorced from the realm of like business and entrepreneurship.
Absolutely not. They can be cringe hippies too. That is not a political alignment there. Business school proved an eye-opening experience. It forced me to confront ideas about economics, capitalism, and social welfare that I'd always taken for granted. In italics here, is corporate greed a force for evil if it leads to innovations that save lives? Is protectionism good if it leads to higher prices for consumers and bankrupts farmers in other countries?
Oh my God.
She's finally having her mind expanded in the heterodox, totally anti-status quo institutions known as the business school.
This question is corporate greed a force for evil if it leads to innovations that save lives? Well, yeah, not if you grant that it leads to innovations that save lives, but I don't grant that.
No.
Like, I don't think it's corporate greed that leads to that. I think it's research funding, which primarily
Yes.
comes from the government
Precisely.
and is now being slashed by like the most business oriented president of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't. I really don't think like you were confronted about ideas in in an intellectually rigorous way. I think you were just given a new ideological dogma.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so I'll gloss a little bit of this person's biography here for the sake of time. She went on to found this educational nonprofit called the Mill Institute, named after John Stuart Mill, noted utilitarian philosopher. And so she founds this institute that is basically creating educational materials for middle school, high school, and higher education teachers to basically increase viewpoint diversity in the classroom, which is to unsettle settled thinking, to borrow the terms of her colleague Ilana Redstone, who's also involved with the University of Austin prior to Avishai getting involved. But she and her colleague Redstone moved the Mill Institute officially over to the University of Austin in, I believe it was in 2023, when they basically pitched this idea of moving the institute in, having it be part of the educational mission of the University of Austin. They impressed a lot of people and brought in a lot of donations. And of course, they were the cause celeb of the University of Austin for a while. But then she's saying that she's starting to notice some cracks in the facade.
Can we stop just for a second though?
Sure.
This idea of viewpoint diversity, and I know it's going to come up here in a second, but just we should flag that.
Yes.
That's an extremely loaded ideological term that is primarily like disparaging by implication actual diversity.
That's right.
To basically say that DEI initiatives are sure they're increasing diversity, but they're reducing viewpoint diversity because all of the many different identities of people who are being brought into institutions, they all think the same. That's sort of the assumption of this term. And so that makes it really problematic.
That's absolutely right. And I thank you for flagging that, because that also gives me an opportunity to plug one of our other episodes that we did with Dr. Bradford Vivian and his book, Campus Misinformation, where he does an entire chapter-long treatment of that ideograph of viewpoint diversity, calling attention to the fact that it merely means making sure that, for every liberal viewpoint, you hear a conservative viewpoint, however you want to define those binaries there, rather than doing some of the more kind of critical work of becoming an educated person. So she says, for my own part, I tried to remain open-minded. She's referring here to some of the kind of, she's getting an inkling that this place is more of a breeding ground for conservative culture warriors than an actual pursuit of veritas. Starting a university, I reasoned, is a complex undertaking, and so it was expected that all would not go exactly to plan. Yes, it disturbed me that some colleagues used party horn emojis on Slack when responding to circulated articles describing political hardships at other universities, as if we were in a zero-sum battle with the rest of academia. But I did my best to ignore such episodes. It turned out that what I was observing was symptomatic of the larger ideological tension developing at UATX between two camps. Those specifically championing an unabashedly, quote, anti-woke conservative agenda, and those, such as myself, prioritizing academic freedom more generally.
I would imagine that that's a very small camp, the one that she is in. I mean, that sounds like the most wonderful, fun. I just would love to be in that Slack, is what I wanted to say. I mean, that just sounds like a wonderful place to be, where they're just, kikiing and partying about universities getting shut down. That's great.
Yeah. Yep, it really does tell you just how kind of like petty these people are behind the scenes. And again, what their whole thing is really about, which is not championing truth or diversity. It is about this kind of perceived grievance that they have with mainstream academia, and its perceived loss is their perceived gain. She does write in here that she was at first relieved to observe that the university administration, faculty, and advisors spoke openly about the tension, and that the academic freedom side seemed to have the upper hand. But then she says, I felt blindsided when on March 3rd, UATX ended its relationship with the Mill Institute. And it is over a LinkedIn post that Ellie Avishai posted back in, I believe it was March or February, wherein she is sharing another piece from another author who's doing this kind of what she calls an even-handed treatment of the concept of DEI. She writes here on LinkedIn, great piece from psychologist Michael J. Strambler. We can have criticisms of DEI without wanting to tear down the whole concept of diversity and inclusion. And then, of course, the Mill Institute gets a shout out in that article as well. She quotes briefly from his article, but that's really all the commentary that she herself made on the matter.
That's spicy. I don't think she should get away with that.
Yeah, we talk about, just opinions that are better kept to yourself. I mean, the level of venom in that post, it's, ooh, boy, I can see why there was such a stern reaction to her.
Don't shit post on your professional LinkedIn.
Saying things like, we can have criticisms without wanting to tear down the whole concept. That kind of even-handed treatment of a concept belongs nowhere in the halls of take no prisoners academia. She quotes a little bit here to contextualize. In a speech delivered last year, Neil Ferguson, one of the co-founders of University of Austin, argued that, quote,
the path to hell for universities has a sign that reads diversity, equity, inclusion. And you have to understand that. I'm sorry, because I know these words sound nice and nobody wants to be against them, but I have to tell you that in George Orwell's 1984, words mean the opposite of what they appear to mean. So what diversity, equity, inclusion turned out to mean at Harvard was uniformity of thought, no equity, no due process for anybody who fell foul of the Inquisition, and exclusion of conservatives and indeed anybody who was deemed to be too far to the right.
Notwithstanding Ferguson's obvious hyperbole, I appreciated his point. What I did not appreciate was the university's increasing tendency to fuse this kind of substantive critique of DEI with caustic criticism of other universities, including UATX's nearby neighbor in Austin, the University of Texas. On 20 February, for instance, the official X account of UATX posted, quote, high school seniors, if these college courses sound interesting to you, Latinx sexualities, queer television, Chicana feminisms, black queer art worlds, queering black religions, ... there's a really good option for you across town, end quote.
That's a pretty nice ad for
I was
University
gonna say,
of Texas at Austin. Yeah.
Even when they're shit posting, it's kind of just like, hey man, don't threaten me with a good time. That actually sounds kind of cool, honestly.
Yeah. Are you kidding?
I mean, of course, obviously reading into the fact that almost every single one of these courses that they're mentioning is signaling to a non-white identity marker. That's also, I think, a very important thing that's going to come back around here. So, she's saying that the tone of these communications baffled me. They betrayed a lack of patience for the more nuanced conversations about the historical challenges that DEI initiatives were originally designed to address. Still, it never crossed my mind that, at UATX of all places, I'd feel pressured to conform to any kind of institutional dogma, or that a more moderate perspective about DEI could be considered what Orwell called thought crime. On the contrary, I assumed that opinions such as mine proved the university's rule. I could freely express a critique, not just of the university, but of the federal government, believing that my, admittedly rather unoriginal, perspective added to the intellectual diversity of the university. But what happened next suggested I was wrong. By 5 p.m. on 3 March, the same day I heard that my LinkedIn post was a problem, my team of 5 and I were all on our way to being pushed out of UATX. I got the news from a junior dean whom I barely knew. He told me bluntly, quote, the trustees and the management have decided that we'd like to wind up Mill, and I'm calling to let you know that we're letting you go, end quote.
We're winding up Mill. Sorry. No, yeah, like this is I'm sorry, like the fell for it again award is
Yes.
yours. You
Says
fell
yet
for it again.
Yep, you fell for it again. It's another instance of I voted for the leopards eating people's faces party, and now I'm complaining that the leopards are eating my face.
Yeah, like why would you assume that opinions such as yours would be tolerated? Like this is a conservative university. It's not. That's the thing, and I think we covered this on the first episode, but at this point, free speech is a conservative ideograph in a lot of these conversations, where it's not so much actual free speech as it is the speech of the free. And for them, the free are people who hold conservative stances. So, like, you should have gotten an inkling from the kinds of people they were assembling as faculty and the people who were bankrolling and running the university that it's not actually open to multiple viewpoints. Like it is a very monocultural institution.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I have to say that I do feel a little bit of sympathy for people like Avishai who don't strike me as, they strike me as credulous, if nothing else, to the kind of rhetoric that is being used by the UATX founders to, again, try and provide this sort of like centrist facade to what is indeed under the surface a very right-wing project, to say that, no, this is actually about fairness and equity, which again, I think are virtues and values that, you know, just after having read through some of the Mill Institute's curriculum, I mean, it all feels like educational, like pedagogical materials written by business school people, but it's ultimately pretty benign, right? Like it's not anything like the kind of demagoguery and sort of masqueraded fascism that is being proclaimed by some of the other people like Neil Ferguson. But, you know, speaking of platitudes and papering over things, this is my favorite part of the article here. The university's constitution, she writes, which details the scholarly freedoms owed to faculty and students in detail, contains no protection for affiliated institutes. That's what she and her colleague in the Mill Institute were. I had no recourse, and there was no discussion. 2 days later, when an internal email was circulated to update my former colleagues on the issue, it was couched in vague euphemisms. Quote, as part of the board's conversations about the strategy for the next phase of the university, the decision was made to restructure the Mill Institute. This restructuring is part of our ongoing efforts to be laser focused on the university's core mission and goals, as well as its broader academic and institutional priorities. End quote. For all of Ferguson's warnings about Orwellian distortions of language, the message struck me as a lot like doublespeak. And all I have to say to that is this is truly the day that University of Austin really
became an actual university.
Became an actual university when they learned how to wield bureaucratic non-speak or double-speak like that. Bravo.
To cut a program.
Bravo.
To cut a program, right?
Unbelievable.
I mean, yeah.
Perfect.
100%,
a masterclass.
100%. And this exposes the real blind spot of these conservatives about free speech, because free speech is truly impossible under capitalism. This is the primary thing that restricts free speech, because you need resources, you need a job, like you need to have venues to speak, and those venues are closed off. This is what Van Dyke talks about in 1992 or 1993 article, The Principles of Critical Discourse Analysis. He talks about access as one of the most important issues in discourse analysis, because if you don't have access to spaces in which to speak, your discourse is meaningless. Like it cannot be heard. And so for Avishai, this should be like the biggest wake-up call that your business school education, like in one sense, revolutionized your thought, but it also gave you a whole new mystifying ideology that prevented you from seeing that capital controls speech, that capital at any given time can withdraw your right and your privilege to speak. And that's exactly what happened to her at UATX.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, again, like I said, there's a part of me that does want to feel sympathetic for that, but there's another part of me that says, well, lots of people were able to see this coming too. And again, I don't harbor ill will against this person. I hope that they land on their feet and that, again, they take this lesson to heart that, these are not people to be trusted, that this kind of rhetoric is masquerading fundamentally, illiberal, if I may borrow their turn of phrase, illiberal political motivations, right? It is designed to close down the arena for speech and not widen it, although it's saying the opposite, right? She concludes her article here just by saying, if UATX officials want to prevent their school from operating merely as a high-concept readout for conservative culture warriors, boy, imagine that, they should recommit to the school's own founding principles and leave the vitriolic, quote-unquote, anti-wokeness fusillades to podcasters and YouTubers. The school must be unwavering in its commitment to free inquiry and show itself to be a welcoming home to a diversity of views, not just those that fall within a range acceptable to its biggest funders and most influential administrators. She's kind of covertly referring here to people like Joe Lonsdale, the co-founder of Palantir, as well as other venture capital firms, who is the chair of the board of trustees, who has also railed against DEI, among other kinds of issues here. Stoking grievances against other universities might be a good way to bring in donor dollars, but in the long term, it's a losing strategy, as institutional hypocrisy inevitably has a dispiriting effect.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know what you would expect, again, based on the founders, the other faculty. Like, you need to kind of think critically about what this is doing. And I do think that that anecdote from the beginning of the article about the Slack channel where they were just like partying about the fact that other universities are struggling, that's very revelatory of what this is really all about, which is that I think it's, again, to come back to the kind of Austin tech bro aspect of this, it's kind of like doing what Uber and Airbnb have done for their respective industries. Or trying to. I don't know if it's going to succeed, and I think it probably will not. But the real goal here is to present an alternative and to kind of like be insurgent towards the industry of universities, especially I think universities that get public research funding and public funding of various sorts, right? Because they view that as inherently like a misuse of funds. They want those funds going to the rich. They want those funds to basically just be replaced by tax cuts. And so, yeah, I think it's very obvious that this is not about free speech as much as it is just like, we want our own university where we don't have to be confronted with other viewpoints. We want our viewpoints to just be unchallenged. Right. And that's really what, this idea of viewpoint diversity occludes, is that like, they don't want actual viewpoint diversity. They want unchallenged conservative dogma.
Yes. No, that's absolutely, I think, spot on. I mean, this is the kind of long-term, I think, one of the long-term projects of the inchoate propaganda arm of the American right wing is to, try and establish a kind of quasi-intellectual foundation for the kinds of, very paradoxical and contradictory ideas, which is that, again, upward flow of wealth to the top 1% of people is necessarily going to be good for the rest of the society, or is going to produce all of these good things. It does not lead to more inequality when, again, there's lots of research being done by actual researchers that shows that that is just not the case. And so the only thing that you can do is, again, to defund those people who are exposing the rot at the heart of that paradox, and to try and replace it with this, I'll give it credit, this kind of cohesive propaganda campaign that they're waging against what they have to some degree successfully branded as the quote unquote woke mind virus, that now it's making its way into federal legislation in the halls of power, where they're calling out wokeness and revoking federal dollars for universities based on their degrees of wokeness, whatever that means. I have another article here that I think is also worth touching on. This one was published last year. We didn't really get a chance to talk about it too much on the show, if at all. but it is one that I have been wanting to bring up on the show for a while. It's published in the New Inquiry. It's an essay titled An American Education, Notes from UATX by Noah Rawlings. And it's basically about, I'll kind of gloss it here for the sake of time or some of the context, which is that Noah Rawlings, who I believe to possibly be a graduate student at Princeton University, although I wasn't fully able to track down this person's provenance, which I think is understandable. I don't think they want to get searched up for writing this article about a dark money, right-wing founded university, but decided to go and check out their curriculum of the Forbidden Courses summer program. If you'll recall from our last episode, we did talk a little bit, I think, in brief about the Forbidden Courses, although the curriculum had not really been made clear at the time of that recording. So Rawlings starts out by saying, an alluring name, Forbidden Courses. I decided to take a look. Although my spleen is not inflamed by the culture war, although my heart is not lifted by calls like Barry Weiss's for a coalition comprised of trads, Whigs, and normies, I was curious. How plausible was their project? What ideas would they discuss? I applied to UATX last March. There was a cover letter and the 3 essay questions and the writing sample. I speckled them with Harold Bloom and Nietzsche. Exploitation belongs to the essence of what lives, that sort of thing. April 6th, the letter arrived in my email inbox. Congratulations, UATX is extending you an offer of admission to session 1 of this year's Forbidden Courses. Which I just kind of love that Rawlings did a kind of like SoCal squared hoax to to the UATX people. Just like, you know, he knew the right terms to drop and they were like, ah, yes, one of us. Let's bring him in. Rawlings notes here. The University of Austin is not in Austin. At least this one isn't. I believe that they've actually moved to the Scarborough building, which is a multi-level office complex in downtown Austin, but the Forbidden Courses is not in Austin, not yet. It's 200 miles northeast in Dallas on an office complex owned by Mr. Harlan Crow. Old Parkland, the complex is called. Crow, a conservative billionaire who recently made news for funneling thousands of dollars in undisclosed gifts to Justice Clarence Thomas and his family, gives money to UATX too. He rents out rooms in Old Parkland to the nascent university at what UATX founder Peter Boghossian called a generous rate. I would later encounter the rich Texan at several UATX lectures, squinting and smiling in preppy athleisure.
I love the role of Harlan Crow in the UATX is really kind of, again, giving the whole game away, where it's like much free speech. Like you are fully bankrolled by one of the most evil billionaires in contemporary capitalism who's connected to the Supreme Court, which is really no friend of free speech. The Supreme Court has, I mean, particularly like this right-wing court has allowed a ton of free speech abrogations, has allowed unlimited corporate spending in politics. Like, I think if free speech has any meaning as a coherent concept, it also has to account for different material capacities to speak and to have your speech and discourse travel and be taken up and gain rhetorical velocity. And we know, like from the last several elections, that corporate money in politics plays a massive role. I mean, even the right, and I would guess like even a lot of these people involved with the UATX have called out the Democratic Party for this. The fact that each news cycle of a major presidential election, typically the Democratic candidate has just as much, if not more, corporate money backing it as the Republican does. Yes. It's a massive problem, and it cuts across parties. And so to be so completely financially beholden to this billionaire who is also hand in glove with the Supreme Court that loves corporate money in politics, it gives the whole game away.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to your previous critique drawing on Van Dyke, that this kind of free speech, quote unquote, under capitalism where bad ideas, discredited ideas, easily discreditable ideas have the ability to stay on fucking life support for decades because of billionaire backing by people who have a vested self-interest in keeping those bad ideas alive, really shapes the entire terrain of what we call allowable speech and the freedom to speak in certain ways in a country like this.
I just want to say it does exactly what the ideal of free speech and like a critical public sphere is not supposed to do. As you're saying, it allows bad ideas to remain on life support. It even allows previously discredited ideas to resuscitate themselves.
Yes.
Thanks to corporate money and thanks to these kinds of like filter bubbles and a lot of what we're seeing in like online discourse where like corporate content algorithms allow previously discredited ideas to revive themselves, like vaccine skepticism or even something as absurd as like flat eartherism. If the ideal of free speech was what conservative culture warriors claim it is, like if it operated as they claim it should and does, those ideas should have been defeated in the marketplace of ideas long ago, or in this kind of like agonistic contestation of claims. But that can't happen without control of corporate money in our discourse.
Right. Well, and it's super interesting to think about that point too, because the tack that they're approaching this contrarianism with is a reaction to the fact that their ideas are being so soundly defeated just on a generational level. Like so many young Gen Z and millennial people, from whether it's the experience of material conditions graduating into a recession or a pandemic, the very real contradictions of American capitalism and democracy is to just say, well, that is just the fact that our ideas are being now, quote unquote, marginalized because they're bad, because they're easily discreditable and nobody really will espouse them unless they're being paid to do so. So they're approaching it with that kind of contrarian victim complex. And nobody is better at really kind of embodying that or being the kind of mascot for it than Mr. Peter Boghossian. We talked about him a little bit on the previous episode that we did about this. Peter Boghossian is, of course, one of the 3 original SoCal Squared grievance studies hoaxers, submitted fake papers to a number of marginal humanities journals, and then, basically said, haha, look at these ridiculous studies that we placed. Other myriad intellectuals in this camp include people like James Lindsay, who is really just a certified freak. I can't really say much better about him, but there's some good illustrations of Peter's character here that Rawlings writes about. Quote, "This place is so hard to get into," Peter Boghossian, philosopher, was telling me. Quote, "because it's the top." He indicated an imaginary peak with his hand. "Of the top." He jerked his hand to a higher stratum. Peter sat next to me on the bus going to University of Austin. He was fired up. He was delivering opening remarks later that night. Plus, we'd begun talking about a subject that interested him, exercise. Quote, "It's indispensable for an intellectual," he told me. "You should be exercising. Do you?" "I'd recently started going to the gym," I said. He looked doubtful. Quote, "You got to get into jujitsu, man. I'm telling you." Peter did jujitsu. It had changed his life. He spun around in his seat, scanned the rest of the bus, then whipped back to laser his eyes on me. Quote, "I could murder everybody on this bus and nobody could stop me. It's a superpower," end quote. I thought this over.
Wow. That's not at all alarming about like the kind of, worldview that you have. If that's where your brain goes,
That's
I could
right.
murder everyone on this bus. It's not a cool thing to say, man.
Yeah, this is a guy who reads Nietzsche's Will to Power and is like, "Whoa, man! Like this is about how to be strong, or like this is how to be a cool guy."
Guy who thinks that Tony Soprano is the good guy in The Sopranos.
The Sopranos is just a show about dudes hanging out.
Just a cool way to live your life.
That's right. Oh man, I want to skip down to this other part where Peter comes in here, where Pano Kanelos, the president, is delivering his opening remarks. He starts out by saying, dialogue, he said, from the Greek logos, two rational beings engaged in rational discourse. That's like the Simpsons line, the mono means one and rail means rail.
So then, mono means one and rail means rail. And that concludes our intensive 3-week course.
Thank you for dumbing that down for us, Pano. And with little further ado, he introduced Peter, whom the other students had not yet had the good fortune of meeting. Peter, Pano told us, was, quote, kicking butt in the righteous name of freedom, end quote. Peter springs into the center of the room. The air pressure changes, a buzz, a hum, a current about us. He brims with a frenzied energy. Something is happening. He is going to give us a taste of what's to come, he says. This is the kind of intellectual activity we're going to experience at UATX. We're going to grapple with big issues. We're going to be daring, fearless, undaunted. We're going, he says, to do something called street epistemology. Just what is street epistemology? He'll demonstrate. It's one of the two things he does, the other being jujitsu. Quote, I don't have a life, he says. Quote, I talk to strangers and I wrestle strangers, end quote. But before we can do street epistemology, Peter needs to think of some questions. He turns his back to the audience, hunches slightly and strides, stroking his chin. He is Rodin's thinker, set in manic motion. He is a relentless logician in his study at midnight. He is a frantically philosophical gremlin. Bam! He wheels around and stalks forward and slings his index finger out towards a student, demands of him whether climate change is real, and how certain is he, and why? Bop! He points to another student, asks whether gender is a social construct, whether trans women are women. He cites Socrates and the 7 habits of highly effective people. He staggers and weaves. As a boxer dances, so Peter lectures. He is the professor you never had. He is a squall of raw intellect. He is Robin Williams in the Dead Poets Society, but ripped. He is putting a gun to the head of your most precious assumptions. And then it is over. That, we have learned, is street epistemology. It is asking the hard questions of one another and not refuting them when you disagree, but by continuing to ask why and how certain are you until the temple of their convictions crumbles and you can help them build a newer, sounder one. So what do you think of Peter's street epistemology?
Sounds a lot like Dane Cook, Vicious Circle,
Oh!
kind of that energy.
Oh my
like,
God.
Just like, another noted evil white man, basically. I don't even know what to say about that. It sounds, like this weird combination of Nathan Fielder and Dane Cook.
That is such a great comparison. Like, just add a little cocaine to that equation and you got yourself a Peter Boghossian, baby. Oh my God. In so many ways, it does feel like he's got that kind of like startup guy energy too, where he's like, I'm about to blow your mind with my concepts.
Yeah, it's a TED Talk. I mean, I think we talked about this too. Like, this is just the University of the TED Talk. And, that's cool, I guess. But like, are they going to ever actually learn? Are they going to learn to do anything? Are they going to learn any sort of like methodologies or theories that might be useful? Or is this just, he's basically doing what like conservative influencers do when they walk around with a GoPro or with like a camera and they go, climate change is a hoax. Change my mind. Debate
Yes.
me, bro.
Yes.
Right? Like, what is the difference?
Yeah, it's all of a piece. I mean, this is the Steven Crowder, just sort of like internet provocateur, rhetorical disposition. This has already been done a bazillion times. They're just bringing the internet into real life and pretending that it's some kind of like intellectual force. If we want to learn a little bit more about what actually goes on in the classroom, Rawlings gives us a little snapshot here.
I'm very curious what actually goes on in these classrooms.
Yes. So we have a little taste here. This is Sexual Politics as taught by Katie Roiphe, who is an author who has notably written a lot of sort of like quote unquote post-feminist or critical feminist books that are, things with like the upshot being women are responsible for sexual assault because they invite it upon themselves. Those kinds of, really transgressive and boundary pushing ideas. Rawlings writes, "At last, we could talk without fear. We were among friends, away from the histrionic liberals, far from the gender studies departments. We could commit thought crimes with impunity. We could say things like, quote, it's hard to get a woman's perspective from a man. We could express discomfiting ideas. Quote, if Simone de Beauvoir were alive right now, she would be very popular, like Jordan Peterson, end quote. One might find disappointing the disjunction between UATX's tantalizing marketing and its conceptual yields. UATX had tweeted, quote, dare to think with us, had promised that they were, quote, not your typical summer school, had titled their program Forbidden Courses. But what was aired in this particular forbidden course were opinions neither audacious nor surprising. They were platitudes about the nature of man and woman, of the kind encountered in bad romantic comedies produced in the aughts. Quote, women are more complicated than men. Quote, there are things that women want that they don't like that they want. Quote, with boys, their bodies and their desires are one.
Wow.
These are the intellectual titans of the forbidden courses.
Mind blown, bro.
Oh
my
man.
God. I've never thought about it that way.
Dude, it's truly mind-expanding stuff that's happening in these classes here.
Oh, wait. I wonder if maybe like a sort of a planetary metaphor could be. I wonder if that was invoked at all. And, like kind of men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Something
I think
like
that was.
I wonder
I think
if
that was
came up at all.
that was on the reading list for the course.
Nice.
Sexual politics and biological interplanetary essentialism, I think, is the unit there.
There we go.
One of the things I really love about this article is that it just has some really beautiful turns of phrase that really get at the heart, kind of what's wrong with this whole, just the kind of philosophical and epistemological approach of the kind of free speech expansion, dialogical expansion of the field of reopening and saying we need to examine more viewpoints. He writes here of the full approach of a lot of the courses, surveying the political field without venturing a step, endlessly weighing both sides, taking it all in with tranquility. This is an agreeable position. It allows banal contrarianism to masquerade as enlightened equanimity. Take, for example, a question Roiphe likes to contemplate in her writing and teaching. Is he at fault because he assaulted her? Or is she because she drank too much and passed out? To refuse to decide on that question is, in effect, to allow the consequences of the second interpretation, exoneration, to unfold. What such heroic indecision often amounts to, in practice, is a craven reaffirmation of the powers that be. Yeah. Nailed it.
Nailed it. No, I mean, what are we doing? I mean, this is really what this forbidden concept gets to, is certain things have not been forbidden because they're unthinkable, but they've been forbidden because they're wrong. A debate was resolved, and they want to reopen those debates basically to legitimate power. I mean, that's what he's getting at when he says a craven reaffirmation of the powers that be. And obviously, we know there's a limit on this. There are certain lines that they almost certainly won't cross, although maybe we shouldn't be so optimistic about that. But at what point does open sort of scientific racism then become something that's explored in these courses? Certain identities are genetically inferior to others. That was previously considered legitimate science. That was previously considered a legitimate route of inquiry. So why not explore that if you're also exploring, are victims of sexual assault responsible for their own victimization?
Yeah. And I mean, from what Rawlings continues to write here, those are ideas that are totally on the table, at least for students to bring up here. Not as much about, they have people who are espousing, who have espoused those things other places on the faculty or as invited speakers. But he says here of some of the other students at UATX, I speak of the school's true target audience, of the young neoconservatives who seem to think trans athletes and immigrants were the greatest threat to the union, whose high school tuition had cost 4 times a degree from a public university, who nodded at UATX speakers with graduate degrees from Berkeley or UChicago as they railed against, quote, elites and, quote, elite culture on the office complex of a billionaire. At lunch or between class sessions, you could hear them say interesting things. Consider the remarks of a single afternoon. One student, bravely reviving the pseudoscience of physiognomy, said that if your index finger was longer than your ring finger, that probably meant you were gay. Someone else claimed that 20% of Gen Z identified as LGBTQ. Quote, there's no way a society can evolve if 20% of its population is gay, another student added, shaking his head. Evolve in this case seemed to mean stay the same or turn back the historical clock. Later, yet another statistic was cited. Quote, 7% of France is Muslim. Yeah, a peer replied. That's a problem because they don't want to integrate. The subtext of these remarks was simple. The social capital, political influence, and access to wealth that was formerly the uncontested and exclusive prerogative of straight white men was now under question. They felt it at school. They saw it in the media. They were here at UATX to live out a dying dream, to vent their frustration at its loss, and to help one another cling to it as long as possible.
Boom.
Again, what more needs to be said?
Yeah, that's the whole game.
That is.
And it's like this index finger, ring finger thing.
That is like some middle school shit.
To a large extent, this is really the coddling of the American mind.
Yes.
In a certain way, you know, which is that famous book by Jonathan Haidt, right? Is that Jonathan Haidt?
Yep. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. Yes.
Yeah. The coddling of the American mind, where these young conservatives, you know, the kind who are appearing on Jubilee surrounded debating Sam Cedar.
What's the problem with xenophobic nationalism? Don't you think that's better for Americans in general?
To be xenophobic nationalism is better.
We should have a coherent culture. Everyone should be a part of the same culture. We should have assimilation.
Which, do you get to choose what the culture is?
We already have a dominant culture.
What is
based
the dominant
on
culture?
European and Christian values and identity. That is the dominant culture.
White Christian,
it's rooted in European identity.
White. So your argument is that
has been the dominant culture.
Just to be
clear, and we're not letting people assimilate to that. We're saying you should keep your culture, and this is why our culture is so divided.
Your argument is that Trump is good for those who want a dominant white European culture.
I mean, that is what America is. It's rooted in European identity and Christian values. That's what it has been. Would you really disagree with that?
These types, like, they want their own university where they can just like say juvenile shit that they've been saying since middle school and not have to like learn why it's wrong or learn more in order to complicate it or nuance it or give it kind of like a different significance. And so like these people are fundamentally opposed to the goal of education. Like the goal of education is to broaden your mind and broaden your horizons. Yes. And none of this is doing that. It's reinforcing what they already believe and giving them kind of like legitimacy in promoting it to each other. It's the greatest filter bubble that we've seen like institutionalized in higher education.
No, you're absolutely spot on. And I mean, Rawlings kind of puts a fine point on this. Despite UATX's claims of ideological uniformity in higher ed, the regressive social politics found at the school are not much different from those you might hear as students trickle out of a data structures or financial investments class at a major university. But UATX is a, quote, genuinely safe space, as Barry Weiss puts it, in the sense that it isolates students from the inconvenient opposition of other peers and professors. It is a monoculture of free market faith, which provides, in the end, a venue for young people seeking success in tech and finance to network and to fortify the right-wing ideas that brought them here in the first place. I mean, yeah, that's pretty much what it is.
That's what it is. And, you know, the final thing I'll say about this is that obviously the most conspicuous blind spot that UATX, the free press, and before this recording, I went on and I did a quick keyword search just to see, is there any discussion of the crackdown on free speech about U.S. foreign policy that we've been seeing in the last 2+ years? I mean, really like since 9/11, but
yes,
it's accelerated since October 2023. No, this is not being discussed at all by these types, despite the fact that it is by far the most historically significant clampdown on free speech that we're seeing. It's going to be used as a precedent to shut down all kinds of free speech on all kinds of issues. It's going to make it way harder to advocate for new policies, even in domestic policy. And these people don't care about it. And the reason is that they're not actually committed to free speech.
No, that's right.
Like the issue of U.S. imperialism is, I would say, the place where we've seen like the most disconnect between public opinion and settled debate and actual translation into policy in the last 25 years. And these people just like never bring it up. And the reason is that it would puncture their entire worldview. Many of the people who are associated with this are connected to military contractors and have
Joe
all kinds of-
Lonsdale.
yeah, like Palantir. I mean, Palantir is profiting from U.S. empire. So of course they can't question it. And obviously, like Harlan Crow is connected to the entire conservative wing of the Supreme Court, which has largely ratified all executive power when it comes to war making and imperialism. And so they don't want to say anything about it. You don't look a gift horse in the mouth. So they really can't speak freely. And that just gives the entire game away. This is about culture war and kind of positioning and really just kind of forming their own little clique from which presumably a million podcasts will bloom.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, in a very sort of limited sense of the term, a social movement in that it is attempting to, again, kind of insulate or provide a safe space for this milieu of bad ideas that are objectionable to the broader, not only just intellectual community, but like society in a big way. Many people who are faced with these ideas, honestly stated, find them abhorrent and do not actually support them. And they need to continue feeling like they can live respectable lives, which again is not to say that, like, I'm not here to say that the students, especially who are going to this, are themselves irredeemable. I think that it's important to note that what we should be really championing here is to go back to what Brad Vivian said on one of our previous episodes. Like, what is the foundation of good intellectual work? It's evidence-based argumentation. It's actually avoiding the kind of tempting draws of this kind of demagoguery and actually trying to do good work and educate other people to be part of that larger project of doing actual inquiry, solving real human problems, and actually seeking the good for the largest number of people possible. I mean, I don't see UATX doing that. I don't see them doing it anytime soon or at all. And I think the more that comes out about this university, the more it's going to become clear what this was the entire time, which is just a money and influence laundering operation for some of the most abhorrent ideas that have ever come through this country.
Yeah, I really hope that we get more exposés like this to find out like what the students are actually learning and even like what the students think of what they're learning. Because I would imagine there's a lot of complaints about these classes. Like, what are we actually learning? This is primarily every class that I've attended has just been my anti-woke professor ranting about things that annoy them. None of this is translating into a future career except in like right-wing YouTube. So I'm wondering what I'm actually getting out of this. And that just reinforces for me, like, you and I throughout the history of this show have been very critical of academia and of like the institutions that we are necessarily a part of in this industry, the ways that they shut down free speech, the ways that they cut programs and like don't give enough support for critical work. Still, for all those flaws, like you're saying, in actual higher education, people are interested in pursuing knowledge. Like, they're interested in actually assembling evidence, learning about the world. And that does have value. I think especially in a time when politics is so fucked up, it makes me feel really good that higher education still exists, that it allows us to pursue knowledge and learn more about the world and broaden our minds. These kind of insurgent marketing campaigns against it, I think, are reprehensible. I think the UATX is reprehensible. I'm not going to like sugarcoat that. I do agree. Probably a lot of the students are kind of victimized by the marketing, and I wouldn't hold them accountable for it. But I guess we'll see. As you said, we'll see where it goes. I don't think it's long for this world, and I won't cry over its demise. But yeah, I just don't see how this is sustainable. These students are going to come out with really nothing tangible, like even less tangible than they're getting from horrible mainstream academia, which gives them nothing and charges them tens of thousands of dollars, right?
Well, the next episode that will come in this series is when inevitably we already had an op-ed written by a dissatisfied faculty who or an affiliated institutionalist. The next one is going to come from a dissatisfied student. Guarantee it in the next couple of years. That's where I'm placing my bets right now. So we'll be back on this beat when that inevitably happens. Don't always like to call a shot like that, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. So
nothing spoken, nothing canceled.
That's right.
And I guess I feel for you, Avishai. This is what happens. You fell for it again, and hopefully it's your last time falling for it. So epically.
Yes, let's all do better. Let's all pursue evidence-based argumentation. We've really enjoyed getting to spend this time talking about an old hobby horse of ours, something that is nonetheless very important and very clearly near and dear to our hearts. So thank you, listeners, for joining us in this journey together. We'll be back at you again with more Reverb soon. But until then, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.